All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Back to school today, but no worries, no pop quizzes or anything like that. We're going to be looking at a 7th grade math textbook from Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
It's called AC-7-1-1-1-1,
Of course.
and it covers the basics of algebra, specifically single and two variable linear expressions,
Got it.
kind of like the ABCs of algebra, you know.
Yeah.
And by the end of this deep dive, I think you'll see how even these seemingly simple concepts can actually unlock some pretty powerful problem-solving skills that you used every day without even realizing it.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how math education can be so different across cultures.
Right.
And this Taiwanese textbook, I think, offers a really unique perspective on how some of these really fundamental algebraic concepts are taught.
Yeah, one of the first things that caught my eye was how they dive into this concept of unknowns.
Yeah.
You know, those X's and Y's that just kind of tend to haunt people's math nightmares. They break it down into 4 levels: position numbers, indeterminates, unknowns, and then variables.
Interesting.
It seems like they're really trying to build this solid foundation
Yeah.
for understanding what those letters actually represent.
I see what you mean. It's almost like they're demystifying the X.
Yeah.
Instead of just throwing it out there as a placeholder.
Yeah.
They're really showing how its meaning evolves as you go deeper and deeper into algebra. It's almost like starting with a simple puzzle piece.
Right.
And then gradually revealing the bigger picture as you go.
Exactly. So they start with these position numbers,
Okay.
which are basically just placeholders for specific values in an equation. So for example, 5 plus 8, 8.
Right.
That question mark is just waiting for that number 3 to kind of complete the equation.
It's a very concrete starting point.
Yeah.
Almost like introducing the idea of a missing piece without even using a letter yet.
Exactly. Yeah. And then they move on to these indeterminates, which are a little more flexible. They're like placeholders that could represent multiple values. So the example they use is 8 plus x equals 13.
Right.
And here, x could be 5, but you could also add or subtract from it.
So it's getting a little bit more abstract at this point. They're starting to hint at the idea of a variable, something that can change, right?
Yeah.
Or take on different values depending on the context.
Right.
It's a subtle but important shift
Yeah.
from a fixed solution to kind of this range of possibility.
And that leads us to the classic unknown, where x represents a specific solvable value.
Okay.
Like 5x equals 130, where x has only one right answer.
It's interesting how they use the word unknown there.
Yeah.
Because in a way, all of these levels kind of represent unknowns in some form.
Right.
But I guess at this stage, it's really about finding that one precise solution that unlocks the equation.
Yeah, it's like those detective shows where they're searching for that one missing clue that solves the whole case.
Yeah.
And then finally, we reach the level of variables,
Okay.
which represent a range of values that can change.
Yeah.
And this is where it starts to feel like real-world algebra,
Yes, exactly.
They use the example of T representing the daily temperature, which obviously fluctuates
Of course.
throughout days.
This is where I think it really clicks for a lot of people.
Yeah.
They're connecting this abstract concept of a variable to something tangible and relatable.
Right.
It suddenly becomes less about manipulating symbols
Right.
and more about representing how things actually change in the real world.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder, did they choose to present these levels to sort of help students understand the history of the concept itself?
That's interesting.
Did early mathematicians use x as just a simple placeholder?
Mm-hmm.
And did the idea of a variable evolve from there?
That's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
It would make sense, right?
Yeah.
You start with the most basic concept and then you build on it as you encounter these more and more complex situations.
Right.
It's almost like building a mathematical language,
I like that.
starting with simple words and then eventually forming these complex sentences.
Yeah, beautiful.
But no matter how we got here, one thing's for sure, variables are the backbone of algebra.
Absolutely.
Without variables, we'd be stuck solving only the simplest equations.
Yeah.
Variables give us the power to express relationships,
Mm-hmm.
model situations,
Yeah.
and ultimately solve problems that we encounter in our everyday lives.
Okay, so we've explored these different levels of unknowns,
Right?
but how does this Taiwanese textbook then move from there to this idea of algebraic expressions?
Yeah. Well, they seem to emphasize clarity and efficiency in mathematical communication,
Okay.
which is crucial when we start building and manipulating expressions.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing they stress is simplifying the notation.
Okay.
particularly when it comes to multiplication.
I see.
So instead of writing 6xx,
Right.
they encourage using a dot or even omitting the multiplication symbol altogether. So it just becomes 6x.
Yeah.
Might seem like a small change,
Uh-huh.
but it goes a long way in making expressions less cluttered
Right.
and easier to work with.
Yeah, especially as the expressions get more complex.
Right.
Simplifying that notation can make a huge difference
Yeah.
in understanding them and manipulating them.
That's like decluttering your desk to make space for more productive work.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's about creating a cleaner, more efficient workspace.
Right.
In your mind,
Yeah.
as well as on the page.
So by simplifying the notation, they're making algebra feel less intimidating
For sure.
and more approachable,
Yeah.
which is great, especially for students who are just starting out.
And it's also setting the stage for more complex concepts to come
Right.
by establishing those foundational principles early on.
Yeah.
They're really laying the groundwork for a deeper understanding
Yeah.
of algebraic operations.
All right, so we've got our unknowns.
Yeah.
We've got this streamlined notation. What's next on this algebraic adventure?
Well, now that we know how to represent those unknowns,
Right.
it's time to start combining them
Yeah.
with numbers and operations.
Right.
So we're moving from the individual pieces to building more complex structures, algebraic expressions.
We were ready to dive into the heart of algebra,
Exactly.
manipulating expressions to solve problems.
That's it.
But this is where things can get tricky for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely.
How does this textbook approach the idea of adding and subtracting algebraic expressions?
Well, one of the key concepts they highlight is this idea of like terms,
Okay,
which is essential for simplifying those expressions.
got it.
And to illustrate this, they use this really clever analogy involving sandbags and weights.
Sandbags and weights, how does that relate to algebra?
So imagine you have a pile of sandbags,
Okay,
each representing the variable x,
okay.
and then a pile of weights, each representing a constant value. And you can only combine sandbags with sandbags and weights with weights.
You can't add a sandbag to a weight.
Exactly. It's like trying to add apples and oranges.
Yeah.
They're fundamentally different things.
Right, right.
And in algebra, it's the same principle.
Yeah,
You can only combine terms that have the same variable.
got it.
So for example, if we have the expression 3x plus 2yx plus 5 foot,
Got it.
you can combine the x terms, so 3x minus x equals 2x.
Right.
But the y term and that constant term, they have to stay separate.
Okay.
So the simplified expression would be 2x plus 2y plus 5 foot.
It's like sorting your laundry.
Oh, I like
You wouldn't put your
perfect.
delicates in with your jeans, right?
Exactly. Each term has its own category.
Right.
And you can only combine terms within the same category.
So this textbook takes a very visual and hands-on approach to explaining this concept.
Yeah,
I bet that makes it much easier for students to grasp.
definitely.
And they don't stop there.
No.
They also provide like a step-by-step guide
Mm-hmm.
for simplifying expressions,
Yeah.
which helps to avoid those common mistakes.
Mm.
It's like a roadmap for navigating the sometimes confusing world of algebraic addition and subtraction.
All right, so we've mastered addition and subtraction.
Okay.
What's next on our algebraic journey?
Well, now it's time to take it up a notch
Okay.
and tackle multiplication and division.
Ooh, things are getting interesting.
And I have a feeling you're about to introduce a concept that many people might find a little intimidating:
Here we go.
the distributive property.
The distributive property
Dun, dun, dun.
often causes confusion,
Right.
but it's actually a really elegant and powerful tool once you understand it.
So how does this textbook present this seemingly complex concept?
They start by using a really familiar analogy,
Okay.
sharing gifts.
I like it already.
So imagine you have 3 gift bags,
Okay, 3 gift bags.
each containing 2 apples and 1 orange.
Okay, I can picture that, yeah.
All right, so you could distribute the contents of those bags, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning you'd give each person 6 apples.
Right, 3 bags times 2 apples per bag.
Exactly. And 3 oranges.
3 bags times 1 orange per bag.
That's right.
So instead of dealing with bags, we're essentially dealing with parentheses in algebra.
Exactly.
Okay?
And they apply the same concept to algebraic expressions.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, 3 2 by 2 can be distributed to become 6 by 6.
Okay.
Each term inside those parentheses is multiplied by the 3 outside.
So the distributive property essentially lets us unpack those parentheses
Yeah,
and simplify expressions, making them easier to work with.
precisely. It's like having a key that unlocks those parentheses
Right.
and allows us to rearrange and combine terms
Yeah.
in a much more manageable way.
It's interesting how they connect this seemingly abstract mathematical concept
Mhm.
to a real-world scenario like sharing gifts.
Yeah, it really helps to demystify it, right?
Yeah, it does.
It's a great example of how this textbook emphasizes making algebra relatable
Yeah.
and relevant to students' lives.
So the distributive property allows us to simplify these more complex expressions. What other challenges does this textbook help us to kind of overcome?
Well, we've been focusing on expressions with a single variable,
Right.
but the real fun begins when we introduce a second variable.
Ooh, things are about to get even more interesting.
Exactly.
Adding another variable, it's like stepping into a whole new dimension in algebra.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
So this textbook, they define two variable linear expressions, which involve not just x, but also y.
Okay.
And then they dive into how to simplify these expressions
Got it.
using all those same principles that we've already learned.
So it's like building on that solid foundation that they've established
Precise.
with single variable expressions.
And to make this new concept relatable,
Yeah.
they use examples like calculating the total cost
Okay.
of buying different quantities of apples and oranges,
Oh.
represented by X and Y respectively.
I like it.
So instead of just manipulating those abstract symbols,
Uh-huh.
we're now dealing with real-world quantities.
Right.
Apples and oranges.
It highlights how two variable expressions can be used to model and solve these practical problems.
Yeah.
We're moving beyond the abstract and into the realm of real-world application.
Exactly. That's the goal.
So even though we've added another variable,
Yeah.
it's not just about making things more complicated.
Right.
It's about expanding our ability to represent
Yes.
and analyze more complex situations.
Absolutely. Adding that second variable opens up a whole new world of possibilities
Yeah.
for expressing relationships and
Yeah.
solving problems.
It's like getting a new set of tools to explore a wider range of mathematical landscapes.
I like that. That's a good one.
This is fascinating. We've covered a lot of ground already.
I know, right?
From understanding unknowns to simplifying expressions with 1 and 2 variables.
It's amazing.
But it's clear that this Taiwanese textbook goes beyond simply presenting formulas and procedures.
Absolutely.
They're really trying to foster a deeper understanding
Yes.
of the underlying concepts.
And I think that's what makes it so effective.
Yeah.
We'll delve further into how they achieve that in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But for now, I think that's a pretty good start.
Yeah, it's been a great start, I think.
I'm excited to keep going.
I am too. Stay tuned.
Welcome back. It's really amazing how much depth there is to these seemingly simple algebraic concepts.
I know, right? And what's really impressed me about this textbook is that it doesn't just like throw formulas at you.
Yeah.
It really dives into the why behind the rules, which I think is so crucial for building that solid foundation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to memorize a formula,
Right.
but it's a whole other thing to understand the logic behind it.
Why?
And this textbook really seems to do a great job
Yeah.
of explaining those fundamental mathematical principles
Yeah,
that underpin those algebraic rules.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like, for example, they explain the commutative property,
Okay.
which basically states that you can change the order of numbers
Right.
when you're adding or multiplying without affecting the result.
Right.
So they show this with like simple numbers,
Right.
like 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2.
Right.
And then they connect that to the idea that like A plus B is equivalent to B plus A.
So it's like they're showing that the same pattern holds true,
Yeah.
whether you're dealing with concrete numbers or
Right.
those abstract variables.
It's about recognizing those underlying structures that govern mathematical operations.
And then they do the same thing with the associative property,
Okay.
which deals with grouping numbers.
Right.
So they show how, like, 2 plus 3 plus 4
Okay.
is the same as 2 plus 3 plus 4.
Right.
And then they relate that to the idea that, like, parentheses A plus B, close parentheses plus C, is equivalent to A plus parentheses B plus C.
Right. So it's all about highlighting those consistent patterns,
Yeah.
which helps to just like demystify the rules and make them feel less arbitrary.
Exactly.
And of course, they also delve into the distributive property,
Yes.
which we discussed earlier. Right.
They connect that idea of distributing gifts to the process of multiplying a number by a sum of terms inside parentheses.
And this time, instead of just sticking with apples and oranges,
Yeah.
they show how the distributive property applies to more complex expressions.
Right.
So they might, for example, demonstrate how to distribute a variable across multiple terms,
Okay.
which is a skill that becomes really crucial as you progress in algebra.
So it's like they're building this ladder of understanding.
Yeah.
They
Exactly.
start with a simple analogy that everyone can grasp,
Right.
and then they gradually climb to more complex applications of the concept.
It's a really effective teaching strategy, I think,
Yeah.
because it meets students where they are,
Right.
and then it guides them step by step
Yeah.
to a deeper level of understanding.
So by emphasizing the why behind these properties, they're not just teaching students how to manipulate symbols.
Yeah,
They're fostering a deeper understanding of the underlying principles of algebra.
which is so important for developing those real problem-solving skills.
It's about giving students the tools to think critically
Yeah,
and logically
right.
about mathematical relationships.
I was also really impressed with the way this textbook uses these relatable examples
Oh, me too.
to illustrate these abstract concepts.
It's one thing to see a formula on a page.
Right.
It's a whole other thing to see how that formula can be used
Right.
to actually solve a real-world problem.
And this textbook seems to excel at making those connections.
They go beyond the typical apple and orange scenarios
Yep.
and introduce examples that are more likely to resonate with students' lives.
Like, instead of just calculating the cost of buying fruit,
Right.
they might use algebra to figure out how much paint is needed to cover a certain area of a wall,
Okay.
or to calculate the distance traveled on a bike ride.
Those are great examples.
Right.
They're relatable, they're practical, and they show how algebra can be used to solve problems that students might actually encounter in their everyday lives.
And it's not just about the practicality of the examples.
Yeah.
It's also the variety of representations they use, like diagrams and visual aids, to help students grasp those abstract concepts.
Like those sandbags and weights we talked about earlier.
I know.
That visual representation of terms is so clever
Yeah.
and so memorable.
It's a brilliant way to make a potentially confusing concept so much more accessible.
Yeah, and those visual aids aren't just helpful for visual learners.
Right.
They can benefit anyone
Yeah.
by providing that more concrete and engaging way
Right.
to understand abstract ideas.
It's like turning algebra into a puzzle
I like that.
that you can see and manipulate.
And speaking of puzzles,
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how this textbook approaches the challenge of solving equations,
Yeah.
because that's often where students really start to struggle.
Right. Right.
Well, from what I've seen, they seem to emphasize a step-by-step approach,
Okay.
breaking down that process into
Yeah.
manageable chunks.
So instead of just presenting a complicated equation and saying solve for X,
Right.
they guide students through the process of isolating the variable.
Exactly. And they might use analogies or visual aids to help students understand the reasoning behind each step.
Right.
So, for example, they might use a balance scale
Okay.
to illustrate that idea of maintaining equality on both sides of the equation.
That's a great analogy.
It makes that abstract process of solving an equation
Yeah.
much more concrete.
It's like those logic puzzles where you have to move objects around to achieve a certain arrangement.
Yeah.
You have to think strategically about each move
Right.
and understand the consequences.
Solving an equation is like a strategic game
Yes.
where you have to make these careful moves
Right.
to isolate the variable and reveal the solution.
And I bet this textbook provides students with those clear instructions
Yes.
and plenty of practice opportunities to master the skill.
They seem to believe that practice is key to developing that fluency and confidence
Right.
in algebraic problem solving.
It's like learning to play an instrument.
Yes.
You can't just read about it
Right.
or watch someone else do it.
You have to get your hands on the instrument
Yes.
and practice, practice, practice.
And just like learning an instrument, learning algebra takes time
Mm-hmm.
and patience
For sure.
and persistence.
Yeah. But with a good teacher
Yeah.
and a supportive learning environment and a textbook that makes those concepts clear and engaging,
Right.
it can be a truly rewarding experience.
I couldn't agree more. This textbook seems to be a great example
Yeah.
of how to make algebra not just understandable, but also enjoyable.
Exactly. And by fostering that deeper understanding of the why behind the rules,
Right.
it helps students develop that love of learning
Yeah.
and that sense of empowerment that extends far beyond the classroom.
It's not just about learning algebra.
Right.
It's about developing those critical thinking skills, those problem-solving strategies,
Yes.
and just that sense of curiosity about the world around us.
Speaking of the world around us,
Yeah.
one thing I found particularly interesting about this whole deep dive is how it's given us this glimpse
Yeah,
into the way math is taught in another culture.
that's so true.
Mhm.
It's easy to forget that there are these different approaches to teaching and learning.
Yeah.
And this textbook has really offered us this fresh perspective
Right.
on how to present these fundamental algebraic concepts.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn
Yeah.
and that we can gain such valuable insights
Right?
by just exploring different perspectives.
And it makes you wonder how those different approaches might actually impact students' understanding and appreciation of math.
That's a great question. Perhaps we can explore that
Yeah.
in the next part of our deep dive.
That'd be great.
We can kind of delve into some of the nuances of this textbook's approach
Okay.
and discuss how it compares to other math education methods.
I'm all for that.
Yeah.
This conversation has really sparked my curiosity
Mm-hmm.
about all the different ways that we can teach and learn math.
I think it's a topic that deserves a lot more attention.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, math is this universal language,
Right.
but the way we speak that language
Yeah.
can vary widely
Pretty good.
depending on our culture and our educational background.
And by understanding those variations,
Yeah.
we can develop more effective and engaging ways to help everyone,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of their background,
Absolutely.
to appreciate the beauty and the power of mathematics.
Well said. I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation
Yeah.
in the next part of our deep dive.
Me too. Stay tuned, everyone,
Yeah.
because we're about to uncover even more fascinating insights into the world of algebra. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into this Taiwanese math textbook. It's really got me thinking about how it makes algebra feel less like a bunch of rules to memorize
Yeah.
and more like a logical puzzle,
I agree.
to solve.
And I think one thing that really contributes to that is the textbook's emphasis on clear communication.
Right.
They're so intentional about simplifying that notation
Yeah.
and explaining the reasoning behind each step.
It's like they really want to make the language of algebra
Yeah.
accessible
Mm-hmm,
and user-friendly as possible.
Like they're saying, okay, let's get rid of all the clutter
Yeah,
and just focus on those essential ideas.
exactly. And we talked earlier about how they encourage students to simplify the multiplication notation
Right.
using a dot or omitting the symbol altogether.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond just that.
It does.
It seems like they're constantly looking for ways to make the expressions less intimidating
Yes.
and more efficient to work with.
It's almost like they're trying to declutter not just the page, but also the student's mind.
Yeah.
By removing those visual obstacles,
Yeah.
they're creating more mental space for actually understanding those concepts.
Yeah, they don't just simplify the notation. They also break down those complex processes
Yeah.
into manageable steps.
Right. Whether it's adding and subtracting expressions
Yeah.
or tackling that multiplication and division, they provide a clear roadmap for students to follow.
And that's so important, I think, for building confidence.
Oh, for sure.
Because when you see this long, complicated equation,
Yeah,
it can be really overwhelming.
absolutely.
But if you break it down into those smaller, more manageable steps,
Right.
it suddenly becomes a lot less daunting.
It's like climbing a mountain,
Yeah.
If you just look at that summit, it can seem impossible to reach.
Yeah.
But if you just focus on taking one step at a time,
Right.
you'll eventually get there.
And this textbook provides those steps,
Yeah.
those footholds,
Those footholds.
for students to kind of make their way up that mountain of algebra.
It's a great analogy.
And they don't just tell you what to do.
Yeah.
They explain why you're doing it.
Right.
They want students to understand that reasoning behind each step,
Exactly.
which is so crucial, I think,
Oh,
for
yeah.
developing that deeper level of mathematical literacy.
It's not about blindly following a set of rules.
Right.
It's about understanding the logic behind them.
Yes.
That's what empowers students to apply those concepts
Right.
in different contexts and to solve problems they've never even seen before.
It's about giving them those tools to think critically and creatively about mathematics.
Yes.
Rather than just memorizing procedures.
Precisely. And that's what makes this textbook so impressive.
Yeah.
It's not just about teaching algebra.
Right.
It's about fostering that love of learning
Uh-huh.
and that sense of empowerment
Yeah.
that extends way beyond the classroom.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
Okay.
What makes this Taiwanese textbook's approach to algebra so unique and so effective?
Well, I think for me, it's the combination of clarity,
Mm-hmm.
logic,
Yeah.
and relatability.
Yeah.
They've managed to present these pretty fundamental algebraic concepts. Right.
In a way that's clear and concise, logically sound,
Mm-hmm.
and connected to real-world scenarios that students can actually relate to.
It's like they found a way to make algebra feel less like an abstract set of rules.
Yeah.
And more like a practical tool for understanding and
Yeah.
navigating the world around us.
And they've done it in a way that's engaging and accessible, even for students who might be intimidated by math.
It's really inspiring to see how they've taken these potentially complex concepts
Yeah.
and presented them in a way that makes them not only understandable,
hmm
but also enjoyable to learn.
It's a good reminder, I think, that there's always more than one way to approach teaching and learning,
Right.
and that we can learn a lot from
Yeah.
exploring those different perspectives and methods.
This deep dive has certainly broadened my own understanding of algebra and how
Oh,
it can be taught.
me too. And I think it's left us with some really important questions to ponder.
Okay, like what?
Like, how can we make math education more engaging and accessible for all students? That's a big one.
Yeah. How can we better connect those abstract concepts
Right.
to those real-world applications?
Yeah.
And how can we foster that love of learning that extends beyond the classroom?
Those are great questions.
Yeah.
And I think the answers lie in continuing to explore,
Mm.
to experiment, and
Yeah.
to innovate in the field of math education.
Yeah, we need to be open to new ideas,
Right.
new approaches,
Yeah.
and new ways of thinking about how we teach and learn mathematics.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been a fascinating journey.
It has.
And it's really just the beginning, I think,
Mhm.
of a much larger conversation
Yeah.
about the future of math education.
Well, to our listeners,
Yeah.
we encourage you to continue exploring that world of algebra.
Yeah.
You might just be surprised by how much you enjoy it.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.